this? I don't know. It's me. It's Amid the Ruins. It's a guy who makes dire wave music. It's Amid the Ruins. Dire wave music. What I've talked about in, probably 100 articles at Jay's Analysis is the implementation of the AI smart grid and the giant smart cities, which is what IBM talks about publicly building. And that's where we're going, and that's what I think we have to be really concerned about. So all of these tensions, they are part of a long-term strategy to basically get everybody moved into mega cities. They'll be forced off of land and so forth for environmental reasons, and basically concocted and invented environmental nonsense. Then you'll be stuck in some hellhole mega city in a, basically a carton-sized apartment living over a Target or something, or inside of a Target or a Walmart, as I said several years ago. It's actually coming true now. There's actually Target cities. This is all part of the long-term globalist strategy. So, but to get there, you've got to have the constant clash, the constant alchemical blending and mixing and smashing together right out of Manichaeanism to produce the convergence, to produce the synthesis. And that's what's crucial in all this, and what is absolutely true from an alchemical, esoteric, philosophical, and geopolitical perspective, the fact the ruling elite seek to be post-human. jaysanalysis.com. Welcome to the next installment of analyzing the giant Wemhoff treatise. So hopefully you've enjoyed the previous part 1 and part 2. And we got it's an important night, but we're here to talk about philosophy and theology. A lot of other stuff going on. Before we get into the next section of the Wemhoff book, I want to talk about a related book, not directly related, but indirectly related, which is Malachi Martin's Jesuit book. Now, again, we want to remind everybody, Malachi Martin is not a reliable character. Martin is, of course, dubious. He was known to have a pretty obvious intelligence connections. He played an instrumental role in Vatican II. He also played an instrumental role in getting it accepted, doing disinformation work. And as you read through his treatises, you can tell that he probably had some pretty clear CIA type of connection and work. And eventually I'm not interested in his personal life. People get into all that. I don't really care about that. But he's obviously inconsistent in the theological positions that he has, because he, early on, in his historical theological books, he discusses things that are pretty much modernist. He has modernist types of views, even to the extent of not capitalizing God in his book, his early theological writings, which I read many years ago. And then we see him, after Vatican II, he takes on this role of being a trad. And I think he was there to create and steer a big portion of the traditional movement. At the end, of course, of Keys of This Blood, which I've covered the entire book in the past, we discussed it as a powerful instance of propaganda. He predicts the sedevacantist movement at the end of the book back in the 90s, and how this would be a big change, that the Roman Catholic Church eventually would split, which is even more relevant now than it was in the 90s. And Malachi Martin also has a lot of other dubious claims and connections in regard to M. Scott Peck and his supposed exorcism stories, which the details don't add up. And a couple of the chapters I wanted to look at in this Jesuits book. By the way, he also predicted the motu propriori, that the Pope would eventually have a allowance for the Latin Mass to bring the trads back into the fold of Vatican II. And of course, all that happened. It happened under Benedict, and of course, that's all been sort of reversed and discarded by the latest instantiation of extreme modernism with Francis. Now, the chapter that's most interesting for us is going to be the Teilhard chapter and the chapter on ecumenism from this book. It's a long book. And of course, Martin himself was a Jesuit. Right? So he supposedly left the Jesuit order. We're doing a pretty high-level analysis, by the way. We're not falling into simplistic dialectics of, the Jesuits run everything, or this group runs everything. We're looking at, really high-level, intelligence-level geopolitical analysis is what we're doing here. And so we'll get to the next several hundred pages of the Wemhoff book. But one thing that's interesting that Malachi admits is that the ecumenist movement is a movement intended to create a one world religion. And it's an attempt to combine the theological presuppositions of Christianity, or Roman Catholicism for him, with Darwinism and the ideas of Swami Vivekananda. And Swami Vivekananda is really the ideological predecessor to the ecumenist movement. And so it never was about, strictly speaking, re-achieving Christian unity. It was always about steering a new religious mindset and world religion into a specific direction. And so he talks about this being a reaction against the strength of Christianity, the Roman Catholic Church, in regard to what he's calling Christianity in the 19th century. And so the power elite in the West wanted a way to kind of alter and steer the Roman Catholic Church. And he says that what happened, of course, is that, for one, at the academic side of things, you had the importation of the higher critical methods. We know about this. Every traditional Catholic knows about this. Higher criticism, which is the German higher critical schools of sort of splitting up the text into these JEPD, documentary hypothesis type ideas of destroying basically the unity and inspiration of the biblical text. And of course, if that's the case, if a person accepts those methods and presuppositions, then it quite clearly leads to the dissolution of one's faith in the history of any kind of church. Right? I mean, if you don't believe in the inspiration of scriptures, you're not going to believe that God guides any single institutional church, obviously, whether Roman Catholic or Orthodox. He mentions the connection to Darwinian and scientific methods becoming sort of the determiner of the theological and scriptural theories. Again, we've covered this for years. That's pretty obvious. And he even admits, as we're going to see Wemhoff admit, that these movements were condemned by the papacy. It's very easy. In fact, Wemhoff himself will list multiple papal decrees, condemnations, propositions, encyclicals, addresses, apostolic addresses, etc., that all go to condemn the position of John Courtney Murray and other people that will figure prominently in the Wemhoff book as pushing this new approach to church-state relations. If you would, feel free to please support the stream through the Super Chats, and I will read your Super Chats later. So we're a little bit more serious tonight. This is a more serious approach. And he says that Jesuits have been for quite a long time in the 20th century the underground modernists. One of these you could read is George Tyrrell. I read Tyrrell back when I was a Catholic. Not because I believe George Tyrrell, but I was interested in reading and looking at some of these modernists. And he was pretty straightforward in his argumentation that, you know, the idea here is first and foremost to sever Christianity from the political and social sphere. And that's one of the ideas of the modernists, right, was to adopt not just the Protestant higher critical method of scriptural interpretation, but also to have a kind of a new approach to church-state relations, the civil sphere. And then you get other people who will do the same type of thing that are famous amongst Jesuits, like Yves Congar. And even to the point that Tyrrell, and I've read Tyrrell, so I'm not just speaking out of hand. Tyrrell, for example, being unaware or intentionally dishonest about preterism, for example, he makes this typical higher critical argument that the New Testament predicted a return of Christ in that first century, and since it never occurred, then obviously Christ didn't know the future, or the Gospels are inaccurate and they record false predictions. No, if you read the Church Fathers, they consistently teach, from Eusebius to Athanasius to John Chrysostom, a partial preterist view that those texts are referring to a 70 AD return of Christ in terms of the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And by the way, there's others as well. It's not just those fathers. There's preterist statements in the Cappadocians as well. St. Cyril of Alexandria has preterist comments. So, but this led Tyrrell and many of the early Jesuit modernists to propose all kinds of modernist ideas, even to the point of outright blasphemous ideas that actually were condemned at the time. So remember, these turn-of-the-century Jesuits were extremely revolutionary. And then into the 20th century, Tyrrell being one of them. One of the things, let's see what Tyrrell, for example, says. And Malachi is quoting Tyrrell at length in this work. Let's see what he says. Tyrrell had a Christian as well as a non-Christian view of religions. To be a Catholic for a modernist is to recognize the other world religions and the variety and unities of experience, right? So basically, Christianity is just one amongst many choices. So they're just apostates. At the same time, he said, Tyrrell, there was no organic unity between any of these different religions. They could all complement one another. In the final analysis, the true religion was nothing more than an adjustment of our conduct to some other transcendent idea. So basically like a Masonic view, right? There's no such thing as warfare for some kingdom, but rather in the ideas of Swami Vivekananda, right? Everybody is basically working to erect a humanistic social sphere. It's better for everybody. These revolutionary Jesuits came up with the idea of base communities as a new way for believers to organize from the bottom up rather than a top-down hierarchy. Base communities. Right. And now other Jesuits, of course, would follow in train, following the exemplar Tyrrell. And this would lead to outright Christian dogmas being denied by famous Jesuits such as Karl Rahner, Hans Kuhn, Charles Curran, Leonard Boff, John Sobrino, and Edward Schillebeeckx. Schillebeeckx even eventually denies the deity of Christ openly. Says God has no son. Christ is just a man. And these are, again, the most famous Jesuits of the 20th century. They're obviously revolutionary figures. And remember, they don't just revolutionize in terms of theology and denying the traditional ideas of church-state relations. And remember, this is not just relevant for Orthodox, for Roman Catholics. It's also relevant for Orthodox because the same methodology of subversion happens now in the Orthodox Church. And it's the same ideas and doctrines that have infiltrated through powerful money, powerful foundations, and Protestant ideas and Jesuit universities like Fordham that somehow have academic sway over what Orthodox Christianity is supposed to believe because of their Orthodox Christian Center at Fordham, the Jesuit university. So we're supposed to listen to a bunch of Jesuits about what orthodoxy truly is. Oh, but the people there aren't Jesuits. Oh, no. They're not Jesuits. They just openly tag, Mike Pompeo in their tweets, right? Which, again, will speak to Wemhoff's lengthy treatment of the connection between the CIA and the Jesuits. Anyway. So Martin goes on to mention that Tyrrell had an open goal, George Tyrrell, the famous Jesuit at the turn of the century, last century, which was the creation of a one-world religion and a one-world government that would guide all of the world into peace. Right. And remember, this is how all of these people still, in these ecumenist mindsets, they all do the same thing. They all argue the same way. They all say, if you argue with people, you're in this older mindset. You're polemical. We're not polemical anymore. We're ecumenical. We don't have dogmas and absolute truths because that doesn't exist anymore, right? Everybody has to submit to this new idea of the evolving of dogma. And unfortunately, again, as we've said many times for the Roman Catholics, it's the Roman Catholics 1,000 years ago that invented this idea of the evolution of dogma with the many papal innovations after the schism between the East and the West. The papacy itself is the original Protestantism, as St. Justin Popovich said. So let's get into Malachi Martin's analysis briefly of Teilhard de Chardin, because I want to give you an idea of what we're talking about with these apostles of evolution and ecumenism. Let me see. The Jesuits are the apostles of evolution. They're their paleontologists. They're famous paleontologists. And they're the They're the evangelists, you could say, of ecumenism. Now, Teilhard was about 20 years after Tyrrell. Tyrrell is late 1800s. And he became fascinated early on with the notion of biological evolution and somehow merging this with religion. So notice that from the outset, there's a presupposition that he has the job and the duty to somehow combine the biological evolutionary philosophy that he's assumed with the religious realm. And which of these two do you think is going to get modified to fit the other? Well, it's not going to be the religious presupposition. It's not going to be the biological. It's going to be the religious views that must be subservient to these so-called scientific presuppositions. Now, he also has this bizarre account. I'm not sure if it may be in this, but there isn't. I think it is. So he got really into mysticism. He got into these direct spiritualist encounters. And there's a specific case where Teilhard claims to have spoken. This is in Father Rose's book. So if you read Father Seraphim Rose's Genesis, Creation, Early Man, he relates a separate account of Teilhard claiming to have spoken to an entity in the desert. And this, I'm not kidding, this entity in the desert, it's in Genesis, Creation, Early Man, told him that, all things are one, dude. It just happens to be the same thing that everybody who does acid and DMT comes to. We're all one, dude. And everything is in this cosmic process of evolution. So now all the theology has to submit to the presupposition of this mystical experience of everything being an evolutionary process. Now, again, it's quite obvious to us looking back that this is demonic, right? This is a demonically inspired inspiration. He probably had this experience. I mean, he speaks early on about giving a preference to mystical experiences that he claimed, right? Even before his experience with the entity. And it says that let me find a good section where he covers it. Teilhard's genius was his attempt to, he means it in a secular way, his secular genius, you could say, was the attempt to integrate and inject New Age philosophy with religious ideas, which eventually led him to a rejection of the notion that Christ was the historical Son of God, but was rather some sort of emergent universal force that we were all sort of participating in, right? It was a single supposition about a supposition. Teilhard threw sardonic obliquity on Cardinal Ruffini of Palermo, who mentioned as a possible way of reconciling evolution with divine creation. Teilhard said, the Cardinal is still convinced that evolution implies that God breathed some soul into some ape. Rather, evolution is irreconcilable about what we know in terms of theology. He says, instead, it's a purely spiritual Godhead bending over, he says, the image of a spiritual Godhead bending over some primeval ape is what Teilhard wanted to get rid of. So Teilhard is, he doesn't even think theistic evolution is coherent, right? Teilhard's theory was that Darwinian evolution was his starting point. And this starting point led him to basically posit that everything, right, was part of this sort of Hegelian process of dialectical process philosophy leading to this sort of what he called an omega point, which is, for him, this is Luciferian, by the way. This is showing you that Teilhard de Chardin is literally a Luciferian. He says individuality will disappear. There will be a long stage of development throughout history where all will achieve a total unity. All individuals will reach a total unity of the omega point of history. He says, we are still in the middle of this process, but once this is complete, unity will be achieved and Christ will become the omega point. He will appear and man will be more than man. This is what Teilhard believed when he talked about the ultra-human. The entire cosmos will be transformed and the glory of it will be established. Now, this is a naturalistic process. This is not supernaturalism. Keep that in mind. He's not saying some kind of Maximus the Confessor, like, transfiguration. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about biological processes being ultimately a spiritual process. And so the natural world is itself the supernatural. It's spiritualized. Basically, it's just pantheism. It's a pantheistic process philosophy. And you can see how this is useful to both the New Age philosophy and to world government, the idea of globalization, because he's basically saying that individualism, being an individual, particularity, distinctions, these are lower forms of being. They're lesser on the scale of being, and they're evolving to dissolution into this omega point. There's no longer real individuality. And it's quite obvious, too, that this is not just, he has to, I'm not an expert in Teilhard. I have a few of his books. I don't really care about this guy, but it's pretty obvious that he clearly has some kind of hermetic influence. I don't think you come up with these ideas and talk about interactions with entities unless you have some sort of hermetic, demonic sort of influence. And isn't it interesting, too, that we're supposed to believe that what we believe is superstition, but these guys are so rational and scientific. Really? The dude claims to have talked to an entity in the desert, right? Oh, but he's so scientific. Look at all these big words that he's invented. Omega point, dude. Whoa, mind blown, right? He says, Marxism is no real difficulty for us. The Christian God on high and the Marxist God of historical process are reconciled in the person of Christ. What? You see how this is, this literally has nothing to do with anything in terms of Orthodox Christianity at all. But this is where, right? And you have a lot of people in modern Roman Catholicism who try to rehabilitate this guy, right? Originally he was condemned in his day, and then, the post-Vatican II popes, maybe we need to give this guy another look. Like, we need to give him another reading. But he eventually just openly posits what the New Testament and the Church Fathers would call Antichrist. Jesus was not really incarnated, right? Jesus is who will be the ultimate omega point representation, right? That will be the real incarnation, is when all of reality evolves into this omega point, this Hegelian thing that he's made up. And he says that we don't really care about the historic Jesus of Nazareth within time and space. We are talking about a Christ mover, a hominization leading to an ultra-hominization to become greater than man. This is just meaningless, right? It's just relativizing the whole of Christianity into meaninglessness. And he's got other, he literally has really bizarre, at times he sounds like Charles Manson. This guy, Christ is Antichrist, this kind of stuff. Christ is Marx is Christ. It's just out there. But this is Jesuit revolution, you see. Jesuit revolutionary philosophy. Why do you think Jesuits have been so revolutionary? Why is the present Pope a Jesuit and a revolutionary? Is this not obvious by now, what's going on here? By the way, if you would like to, please support this show with Super Chats. Be sure to like and share and subscribe. If you're new here, we're covering Malachi Martin's analysis of the Jesuit order and his analysis of Teilhard de Chardin. He goes on to say that the Roman Church, he says, is kind of dying away. It needs to give way to the new process philosophy of the God of evolution. That's his term, the God of evolution. This is what he believed. The the God of the old, old world, ancient world, Middle Ages, that's come and gone. That's a monstrous idea. So he says supernaturalism is a monstrous idea and now needs to be replaced with scientific theory and a form of pantheism. And he said we can use all of the terms, and this is what dupes a lot of people. We can use all the terms of the ancient church: Christ, deity of Christ, cross, suffering, sign of the cross, eternal life. He says, but we just give these new meanings in terms of process philosophy and cosmic evolution. So scientific research, he says, is what we mean by prayer. I'm not joking. He says the scientific class is the priesthood. He says that the sign of the cross is really just evolutionary biological processes of suffering and death. So the cross represents evolution. This was interesting. Sexual continence, he says, really is about eugenics. So he taught that we would perfect man's biology through genetic engineering. I'm not joking. Now you can see why this character is so useful and advantageous for those who believe in transhumanism. I mean, he's literally teaching a Luciferian transhumanist doctrine. Christ has nothing to do with this historical figure. Christ is a symbol of the evolution of man to the omega point where everybody is interconnected in the web. And it would be, I'm going from memory, but I think it's Teilhard that talks about the noosphere. The noosphere being the instantiation of the internet, basically, that would predate or pre-signify the coming interconnection of all reality through the internet and the evolution of matter into self-consciousness. That's Hegelian. That's what Hegel meant by omega point, that there would be a dialectical relationship between thesis and antithesis to achieve this synthesis. But the synthesis is an ontological universal cosmic principle that is moving everything towards some sort of emergent self-consciousness. So there's not a deity outside of time and space, a God that we have a relationship with. God is an emergent process within the universe itself, you see. So he would just take all the terms of, virgin birth or any of this kind of stuff and just reinterpret it in terms of his Gnostic transhumanist gibberish. He says, ultimately, all this means is simply that man is God. Right? Man is evolving to be God. The true divine mother is not Mary the Theotokos. It is the evolutionary process of nature, Gaia. The divine motor. The divine motor that's moving everything in this pantheism is pantheistic process is evolution. I'm sure he would say that nature is Gaia as well. I mean, what else would you say that the Theotokos is? Right? You'd have to say, it's just the process of nature or something. So the point is just that he takes everything, just reinterprets it. So you can't just rely on like a simple one-to-one correspondence meaning of words, right? I mean, every heretical group or sect will say, I believe in Jesus, man. Yeah, but what Jesus? Which one? Right? Who is he? Right? Teilhard, I believe in Jesus. Right? I believe in a resurrection. But he means totally different things, right? And that's what all heretics do, is they will redefine or limit words to not have any significance or reference towards the true concept. Right? When Teilhard redefined Jerusalem was the new humanity, the new God that was evolving. And he wrote a prayer to this new humanity. So he would pray to man. And you'll notice then the similarity between, say, Crowley and Teilhard. Teilhard literally has no difference in terms of his philosophical approach than Aleister Crowley. He says Christ is just the Christ of evolution. And he says that when I pray to the light. The light? What light? He just says the light. I think he's praying to Lucifer, but you can decide what you want. I mean, who knows what he means. Then he goes on to talk about seeing an abyss, which is bizarre, which I think he's trying to give the impression that he's had this dark night of the soul experience. But if you're familiar with the Crowleyan approach, he probably means the Crowleyan approach of crossing the abyss, right? Which is this ritual magician's stage of alchemical process. And he says that when I saw the abyss, it separates my religious view from the world and the vision in which the exercises of Ignatius of Loyola, he says that basing his argumentation on a rereading of Ignatius, he says with a visionary foresight, it might be just that the spiritual exercises are what transpose into terms of a universe in Genesis where we must make room for the ultra-human. Men today, whom circumstances have driven out of the framework of imagination that theology has built, are seeking a new God that is simultaneously personal and yet the ultra-humanity. Who knows what he means, right? I mean, it's just he just says gibberish, basically. And it's the same with John C. Lilly. I mean, reading Teilhard is like reading John C. Lilly. It's gibberish. No, you have no idea what he's talking about exactly, but it's a lot of word salad strung together that doesn't have any clear, determinate meaning. Teilhard says, I think you must resign yourself to accepting me as I am, even with congeniality or weakness, because of which, from my earliest childhood, my spiritual life has been completely dominated by a sort of feeling for this organic reality of the world, a precise, overwhelming sense of the general convergence of the universe in and upon itself, the unique value of man, the path of the rise of life, the axial position of the Catholic Church, the convergent bundle of human activities. At last, it is all consummating a function assumed by this Christ as the center and summit of creation. Now remember, he doesn't mean this in the Orthodox sense. He means evolution. I fully recognize the Roman Church has its reasons for believing that I present in its present form, my vision of Christianity is premature or incomplete. Despite these appearances, I am truly remaining a child of obedience. So, I mean, total delusion here, right? He's openly saying my views are reinterpreting all the mysteries of Christianity, but I'm a loyal, obedient son of the church. Well, maybe a loyal, obedient son of the Roman Church. Yeah, I guess you could be, right? Because as we see now, it has evolved, as we have always said, into outright atheism and humanism and Satanism. He goes on to say that the world process is evolving into a world government. There will be a world state that will emerge to enact the... I mean, how is it not obvious that this is the spirit of Antichrist? I mean, the guy denies Christ historically. John says that to deny Christ come in the flesh is Antichrist. Teilhard says he's working with that spirit that inspires him to say all this. And even Malachi Martin even says that this guy is prophetic for the rise and notion of global government and the one world order. He says, this sounds like Crowley. Listen to this. The world I live in is becoming divine. Yet flames do not consume me, nor do the waters dissolve me. For the pan-Christian I am finding places, union in times of arduous differentiation. I will become the other, and by becoming absolute, I will become my own self. I will attain to spirit only by releasing completely and exhaustively the power of matter. So he's a Gnostic. He will become pure spirit by releasing from matter. He will become other. I mean, it's just just gibberish, just nonsense. Right? And so Tyrrell influences Teilhard. Teilhard then influences liberation theology. Right? Now, again, none of this has any direct connection to, quote, Marxists. Now, there is a Marxist element in the sense that Teilhard says, yeah, I don't have a problem with Marxism because it's just historical process, right? But as we're going to see, the Jesuits and these characters are not aided and abetted and propping up Marxism. Some of them may have. Some of them may have been revolutionary in that sense and part of that dialectic. But what I want to stress here is that we're going to see that according to Wemhoff, the Jesuits are going to be aided by the CIA. The liberation theology that Malachi Martin will say is Marxist. Again, this is an oversimplification. It's not going to be primarily propped up by Marxists. It's going to be propped up by the CIA. And the Jesuits will then become champions of American liberalism. Primarily through, especially the character of John Courtney Murray. So we have 300 tonight. Welcome, everybody. We're covering Teilhard de Chardin. And now we're going to be back to John Courtney Murray and the influential Jesuits. If you want to support the streams, feel free to support me with the super chats. By the way, who else is giving you this kind of content? If you want the full talks, full analyses, you'll have to subscribe to Jay's Analysis because I'm covering material that no one else covers. Nobody else is reading these 800, 900,000 page books for you consistently, giving you my informed analysis. So if you like that, if you want my analysis, my help, please support the work that I'm doing. We don't know how long we're going to be here. In the sense of, in this new age of internet stuff, censor heavy times, anything could leave and be deleted at any point. So please support the work. So we mentioned in getting back to Wemhoff, there was the secret ecumenist meetings that occurred in the 40s at the Biltmore Hotel, and this was to promote Americanism. Obviously, of course, the Murray and company were involved in this. This was part of marrying the Four Freedoms doctrine to the notion of Catholicism. How can we make American Catholics agree to the doctrine of the Four Freedoms? Now, a couple figures step to the fore here. John Foster Dulles, Avery Dulles, the Dulles brothers, the Dulles family. Of course, John Foster Dulles being the Wall Street banking lawyer, future Secretary of State. His son, Avery Dulles, converts to Catholicism and becomes a cardinal. What do you know? And of course, they would also be a Dulles CIA family. They would then promote ecumenism. What? Yes, Princeton University, ecumenism, Dulles's, no accident, right? And so we begin to see that the ecumenist movement is very early on connected to Allen Dulles and the CIA. Allen Dulles would go and, Avery and Allen would promote ecumenism. They would give lectures at the United Nations. They would talk about the need to bring American Catholicism into line with the other religious denominations for the purpose of promoting Americanism and promoting world peace. This is not under any dispute. You can go look up old UN archives of, I think, one of the Dulles's actually leading UN prayers, right? United Nations prayers being led by one of the Dulles's. I don't remember if it's probably Avery, but and I've read Avery Dulles. I've got some of his books over here. I read his book back when I was a Protestant, and it was obvious to me even then before I converted to Catholicism, when I read Avery, that he was obviously a modernist. I mean, and early on, it was kind of, occurring to me, why are these Jesuits being promoted who are so modernist? It doesn't make sense to me. But now, as Wemhoff progresses in his critique, he says it's becoming evident here in the 40s, the mid-1940s, that the American Jesuits are promoting a doctrine of church and state relations that are completely contrary to the historic Latin teaching, the papal teaching of the last 1,000 years of the Latin Church, and completely contrary to the very recent papal encyclicals of that time. And I'll list those here in a minute. For example, I'll just list them right now. For example, now I've covered these for years, but you had the papacy for many centuries, back to the revolutions, the 1700s. The papacy consistently condemned, from I think Clement the 16th or 17th on, the revolutionary ethos, the revolutionary ideas, the secular ideas, on and on and on and on. And it didn't matter how many papal documents they would issue, people just ignored it and they kept marching forward. Up into the modern period of the late 1800s, 1800s and early 1900s, you get Quas Primus, you get the Christ the King, you get Immortale Dei, and you get Temeti Futura from different popes, but of course Leo the 13th figuring prominently there with the condemnation of Americanism. So now obviously the Jesuits didn't care for this in America because they were allied with the CIA. That's what will become the doctrinal warfare program. And the impetus is the Cold War. So they needed to come up with a way to defend, to dogmatize the church-state separation in a strict sense, to promote the American doctrine of the four freedoms and the freedom of the markets especially, to be free from any constraints or informing on the part of the church. How do you do that? In steps John Courtney Murray to come up with a natural law view, which says that Christ does not want the natural law to maintain anything about religious worship or the church. Right? That's the realm of autonomy, and the church has its own realm. So Jesus is really divorced from natural law here, ironically. Now, isn't this what we have said for a long time? Isn't this the arguments that you hear me say about the problems in natural law theory? I mean, you could read Fides et Ratio of John Paul II, where he says that natural law pertains to the realm or the domain of autonomous human reasoning. It's not directly related to any supernatural revelation. All you get with this natural law theory and theorizing in the Latin West, from the time of Aquinas on, is consistent outworkings of atheism, because there's no such thing as an autonomous realm that's not informed by revealed theology. That's the entire presupposition of this whole system. And as David Bradshaw says very clearly, absolute divine simplicity is bound up with natural law theory, and natural law theory is bound up with absolute divine simplicity, all the way back to Aquinas. It's not hard to figure that out. And it's not hard to see the ideological track of the Roman Catholic Church going further and further and further into what St. Gregory Palamas predicted for Barlium and his followers, atheism. Why? Because the assumption is neutrality. God has nothing to say about the social realm and the civic realm. God is confined to the private realm, the religious realm. That's the end result of the presuppositions of this view. The World Council of Churches, which would eventually, so the National Council of Churches, World Council of Churches, right? This entity early on, which was originally in the 40s, was called the Federal Council of Churches, funded by the Rockefellers. it began to also promote this idea that the American idea of separation of church and state should therefore mean, and does mean, no relation between church and state. Remember what Pabianatsev said a long time ago? He says that when you separate church and state, you don't get freedom of religion, you get a state-run church. And you say, well, the Vatican's not a state-run church. Oh, yes, it is. That's the whole point of this book. It is a state-run church. It is a state. It is the first state-run church. Because it is its own state. All neutrality and neutrality-based argumentation is based on a fallacy that ends in atheism. There is no neutrality. Where's the autonomous realm that operates outside the purview of Christ? Have you read St. Maximus? Because he says that the natural world is the world of Christ. It's the world of the logi. It's the logos' world. And the content of natural revelation is the same as the content of supernatural revelation, namely the logos. But the logi are the content of both. What differs is the medium. So Maximus does not teach Aquinas' doctrine of natural law. Clearly. Go read Tollefson's book. He says it very clearly. Maximus says it very clearly. So you'll see then your view of nature and grace, conditioned by your view of God and simplicity, will affect your doctrine of even the civil state and how you view church-state relations. The Roman Church, eventually evolving to accept the full-on presuppositions of autonomy and neutrality, no longer believes that there should be confessional states. Because the end result of accepting neutrality is you will either be more consistent with the atheism that it leads to, or you will reject it and accept the theocratic presuppositions that you should accept. And what have you seen the Roman Church do? It has moved to atheism. You say, oh, they're not atheists? Really? What do you think Francis really believes? If you have agreements with imams who reject the deity of Christ, and you have changed your position on other doctrines of natural law, then you are an atheist, and you do reject the prerogatives of Christ for the social sphere. Clearly. And in fact, Wemhoff will admit that all of the traditional Catholics of the time period arguing against Murray, they all recognized that it was a change in doctrine. It wasn't just a legitimate disagreement. It was a change in doctrine. They're all saying you're trying to change the traditional doctrine. And the mere fact that these people went to war against the Catholic confessional states shows you that. Now, I'm not saying that I side with the confessional Catholic states. I'm saying that the idea of a confessional state is the traditional view. We have to be honest here. Duh. I mean, does anybody know the history of even the Latin West or the East for the last 1600 years? Right? Once the Roman Empire was converted, there were confessional states. And John Courtney Murray, interestingly, Wemhoff records him admitting, yes, it is a revolutionary view. Yes, my view is revolutionary. He says, I'm not agreeing with Marxism, by the way, but I am revolutionary. So remember, it's a mistake to think that it's the Roman Catholic Church as the true good guys versus Marxists. That is a completely, utterly stupid, simplistic approach. It's much more nuanced, layered, and complex than that. Because the people in the revolution here that we're talking about are not propped up by Moscow. They're propped up by the wealthiest families in America. You have to understand that. And so we're going to get the characters of C.D. Jackson enters the picture, who will be an important figure. Him and Lilly will be the key figures for this doctrinal warfare program to utilize the Roman Catholic Church as a tool, a state tool, a tool of state in the Cold War. So they came up with the notion of the atheist empire. And in order to defeat the atheist empire, we would need an intelligence service comparable to British intelligence. And so we get Nelson Rockefeller and other people. We get British intelligence people coming over. We've covered this. The WASP elite basically say, let's take Bill Donovan, he's a good guy, and let's set him up as the head of a new group. And so you get Noel Coward, you get Ian Fleming, William Stevenson, Intrepid, as well as John McCloy, the famous CFR guy, all kind of coming together and saying, let's create this intelligence unit that will be kind of outside of the military, because of course prior to this, intelligence operations were connected to the military. And that makes sense, right? I mean, that's who's going to do intelligence work, would be people involved in the military. No, let's have a private intelligence operation with big time Rockefeller aid and funding. Nelson Rockefeller played a role in this, as well as the other Rockefellers. They helped set up the CFR. Big John McCloy from the CFR goes into helping to set this up, as well as, you got it, Henry Luce of Time magazine. Frank Wisner, also well-known Frank Wisner, would play a role as well. And they came up with this different ideas to set up shortwave radio, to set up foreign radio operations, Radio Liberty, Radio Europe. And these would be involved in broadcasting propaganda nonstop, shortwave radio, 300 stations throughout Europe. And we'll put Wild Bill Donovan over here in charge of psychological warfare. And so Donovan took all of his knowledge from wartime, took all of his knowledge of subversion, sabotage, guerrilla-like actions. He had helped, by the way, set up Mao's guerrillas. OSS under Bill Donovan went and trained Mao's guerrillas. And originally FDR said, we're going to call this the Office of War Information. And he took people from CBS, Columbia Broadcasting System, Elmer Davis, and the other OSS people that you know about, like Paley, Sarnoff. And all of these people would go into helping to create the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services is what it would eventually be called. This new agency was primarily responsible for the coordination and collection of information and intelligence from military, economic, political, scientific, everything. So it's a agency. It's a spectrum-wide approach to intelligence gathering. Many of the early OSS were recruited from the Eastern Seaboard elite schools. Duh, obviously. People like John Foster Dulles, the Dulles brothers, a lot of middle-aged corporate lawyers recruited. Elite universities such as Yale provided much of the early recruitment. Skull and bones. Exactly, right? So OSS CIA comes out of Wall Street lawyers, Yale, Skull and Bones. Around the same time, the idea in 1943 by Henry Luce out of OSS was the idea of creating a magazine for propaganda. And originally, Time magazine itself was going to be the CIA. Literally. The idea was what Time magazine became was originally what the OSS CIA was going to be. So if you want to understand what's the OSS/CIA, Time magazine. Now, Time magazine moved on to become its own private corporation, big media propaganda outlet. But from its outset, as Wemhoff notes, Time magazine was always and completely a propaganda outlet for pure Americanism. And it has never ceased to be that. That's why it now promotes all the same global elite type of stuff. It just had on its cover the Great Reset. And it's promoted every global elite scam since its inception. And I appreciate that Wemhoff goes on to say that really what the OSS and CIA amounted to was a separate government of its own without any purview or oversight that could stir up trouble, be unaccountable, be given billions of taxpayer dollars, and function as a shadow government. There you go. Now, again, this is not a conspiracy book. This is a traditional Catholic lawyer who's writing a book about the history of the relationship between church and state in America and the CIA openly using the Roman Catholic Church for its doctrinal warfare program. Now, who is C.D. Jackson? Well, he was connected to William Paley of the OSS, and he was the Time magazine editor in this early phase. And he would employ all of the tactics and techniques of psychological warfare, advertising, ad agencies, and so forth, putting it into Time magazine. And eventually they decided that the major target for their operations, get this, because of the size of the population, was American Catholics. They needed a figure to be the steering agent, the lightning rod who could steer the Roman Catholics in America. And originally they proposed Fulton Sheen, but they didn't feel like Fulton Sheen could really do it and pull it off. And so they chose John Courtney Murray. So Time magazine would go on to promote John Courtney Murray because they wanted him to be the point man for convincing American Catholics to accept his doctrine, John Courtney Murray's doctrine, of American church-state relations, and then to buy into the Cold War. Now, that doesn't mean that Soviets are good guys, okay? So don't buy into the basic dialectical mistake of me saying this, okay? Wemhoff is a traditional Catholic. He's not a KGB agent. He's not a Soviet. He's not a Russian asset, okay? He's a traditional Catholic. I don't think Wemhoff's position makes sense, because he's going to try to argue in this book that somehow you can make sense of Vatican II, right? At least that's the last I heard of his position. I haven't talked to him. I don't know him personally. Maybe he's changed his position. I don't know. But as far as this book goes, he is within the strain of people who think, well, maybe there's a way to, make Vatican II work somehow. Ironically, however, his own book admits that it is a change in doctrine, especially on church-state relations, obviously. Okay? I mean, it's not hard to read medieval papal statements, Pope Urban calling for a crusade versus Dignitatis Humanae. Okay? I mean, those are night and day, right? It's not hard to figure that one out. Right? It doesn't require a PhD in history and a PhD in theology to see the difference between calling a crusade and saying that religious liberty, bro. Now, C.D. Jackson is interesting because he is a character who could link a lot of different worlds, and hence his placement in Time magazine would allow him to link the intelligence world, the media world, and the banking world all together in the propaganda world through Time magazine. Time magazine and its original staff and crew were all intelligence operatives. That's what Wemhoff says on page 164. The original entire crew, all of them, they were all former intelligence people and people working in intelligence capacities. So notice once again, media, lawyers, it's all a bunch of recruits, okay? So they basically hyped up this notion through psychological warfare that the Soviet Empire was going to nuke everybody, right? Go watch the propaganda of what's that 80s movie that came out during the Reagan period? where the nuke goes off, the TV movie where it freaked everybody out that the Soviets were going to nuke everybody. The Last Day or something like that. It's a obvious propaganda movie, but it's funny when you watch it. I think it has Steve Gutenberg in it. It's like Steve Gutenberg getting nuked. But Wemhoff says that really this was a plan hatched by the Anglo-American WASP elite networks and families. And they needed to find some Catholic figurehead people that they could use to convince Catholics. And they found that character in John Courtney Murray. Now, one thing they wanted to protect after World War II was the Bretton Woods system that had been set up, that of course made the dollar the world reserve currency. And so it was good for American business and American business interests to keep that as it is. This is what would prompt the Cold War. All right, the Cold War dates to the Stalin not accepting the Marshall Plan aid. This begins the Cold War. This begins the idea, let's set up basically the extension of the four freedoms, as we saw. The FDR four freedoms to the world, right? We have to extend decentralization, economic, the removal of what do you call it? Deregulation, decentralization, and extending civil and political liberties as far as possible. Now you can see today the outworking of those presuppositions with the Ukraine, where we now have to extend these liberties to the fullest extent to the Ukraine and presumably everywhere else in the world. And what does that mean? It means whatever's good for the market. The global order of the market, according to Henry Luce and Friedrich von Hayek, if you read von Hayek in the last the appendix of his book, Road to Serfdom, includes an argument for global government. Friedrich von Hayek, Road to Serfdom, the appendix, is an argument for global government. Do you hear that, libertarians? Can you hear me? Why is that? Well, because in order to have trade, you need somebody who can enforce the laws for global trade. Right? Sea power versus land power, this kind of stuff. And so we get, from the U.S. government standpoint, the issuing of National Security Council Memorandum 5501, later 5602, which announces the Cold War, or kicks it off after Stalin doesn't want the Marshall Plan aid. So these two events kind of relate to one another. The idea being then that the business interests in the West, the U.S., the Atlantic sphere, then want to expand their principles and the consequences, right? And Wemhoff has a good analysis and critique of the principles that are presupposed and the consequences of the extension of those doctrines, right? So monopolistic capitalism, then giving primacy of place to freedom of enterprise and the capitalization of all life, leads to the consequences of banks controlling business, right? Ultimately, you get more and more consolidation of the banking power. This leads to more and more practice of usury, and this leads to total monopoly and oligarchy. This is a problem for the religious nations that do not accept the market as the ultimate dominant force in life, or accept usury. So the medieval, the late patristic, early medieval period, both East and West, pretty much tends to reject usury until it begins to be accepted by the Renaissance papacy and later. But even up into this period, the 20th century, there's still places where this is problematic. One of those is Franco's Spain. And so the idea of extending the consumerism to Spain becomes of the utmost importance. Along with the Marshall Plan and the Marshall Plan aid would be the reorganization of the European countries to accept the European common market and the American style and principles of government and market forces. This becomes a doctrine of the National War College, and C.D. Jackson gives the speech, gives the talk there. This is this is page 178, 179. C.D. Jackson talks at the now declassified speech of C.D. Jackson at the National War College to basically make Europe, the European Common Market, through the Marshall Plan, through the reorganization of Germany after the war, into America. And they don't care what your Catholic views are. They don't care what your religious views are. You're going to submit to consumerism. And if you don't like that, you can become a socialist. So notice your false dialectic there. Do you want atheistic socialism or atheistic consumerism? Pick your devil. Do you want Lucifer or you want Satan? Which one do you want? And I appreciate Wemhoff actually admits all that too. He says, look, these are two false options, right? This is what dupes if those guys are bad, then these are the good guys, right? No. What if they're both bad? Did you ever think of that? But it's very difficult, of course, to get the majority of people to accept any nuance because humans typically think in dialectic either or fashion. The next section, part 5, is that the propositions and arguments of these Jesuits, and particularly Murray and others, are contrary to the tradition of the church. Oh, wait a minute. If contrary to the tradition, really, then that would suggest that Vatican II's enshrinement of this stuff is also contrary to the tradition. And if so, then the Roman Catholic Church has changed its dogma. The next few chapters are literally about the doctrine changing. If they're rejecting Leo XIII's teaching, which is a summation of centuries of papal teaching, then Vatican II's enshrinement of the John Courtney Murray view and others is a change in doctrine. I mean, look at the actions of the papacy in the last 60 years. They are clearly contrary to all of the statements and actions of the papacy prior. The papacy says don't have confessional states anymore. We're supposed to do quas primus, temesi futura, right? All of these condemnations of the very things that John Courtney Murray proposes. Oh, but no, it's all, you see, we can all make it harmonized. You see, it all works together. And it's just sad, really, right? And we even get Hollywood jumping on board. Yes, Hollywood. Hollywood jumps on board with HUAC, Ronald Reagan, Americanism, Gary Cooper, John Ford, Clark Gable, become emblems of Americanism. Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Oh, guess what? Those are propaganda films. Propaganda films for Americanism. Now, this is what he says. Wemhoff says, Murray used Theological Studies, the journal that he edited, to expound his theories on church and state. By the summer of 1949, John Courtney Murray was engaging Protestant leaders in the magazine. In September of that year, Henry Luce's Time magazine began to mention and promote John Courtney Murray. He was presented as the defending Catholic apologist for Americanism, blah, 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 blah. Time magazine promoted a series of debates, exchange articles between Dean Walter Russell of Union Theological Seminary, Rockefeller created seminary, and John Courtney Murray, where Henry Luce was a trustee. It was a staged fake fight that was designed to advance Americanism. for Catholics. And the Red Scare helped to promote this. The Russians are going to get us. Go watch Invasion of the Body Snatchers because the Russians are going to get us. The Russians are going to get us. Where have we heard this before? They're still doing the same bullshit line. They just did it for 4 years. The same bullshit from the 50s. Can you believe this? Just repeat the same bullshit since the 50s, and people can't figure it out. It's sad. So, Wemhoff moves on to talk about the fact that the Jesuits would really take up the mantle in America, especially. Not all of them, but many of them. In Europe, the transformation after the wartime period through Marshall Plan aid would convert many of these European nations to American consumerist type principles. Let's see, where does it go on next? How long have I been going here? A little over an hour. Murray gets more and more promotion, and eventually he's given a spot at Yale. This allows him to network with the Eastern Seaboard elite, and he's given a stipend of $9,000 a year in 1951, which is a lot of money for that time, and allows him to really work with the WASP elite and to begin to oppose, and this is Wemhoff, literally to oppose Quas Primus, Christ the King, Immortal Dei, and Tametsi Futura. He begins essentially laying the groundwork in the philosophy and the theology behind rejecting the obvious Catholic dogma of church and state relations. And guess what? Vatican II and John Courtney Murray are victorious. Don't you see this? Don't you see that there are multiple dogmas, multiple documents in this Vatican II? I mean, they literally enshrine the arguments and principles of John Courtney Murray in numerous documents throughout Vatican II. In the Unitatis Redemptio, in the Declaration on Liberty, religious liberty, in multiple Verbum Dei, right, Church in the Modern World. Many of these Vatican II documents literally work on these Jesuit principles. And Wemhoff will even mention many of the peritus. Right? A peritus is a theological consultant and advisor at Vatican II. Many of these notorious characters were periti. Ratzinger was a peritus. Right? He went to Vatican II wearing his coat and tie, dressed like a businessman. Go look at the pictures of Ratzinger in his tie and coat and sport coat and tie at Vatican II. Oh, but he's a trad boy. He's a trad boy. So, I just want to point out that the whole text of Wemhoff's argumentation demonstrates a change in the doctrine. I mean, if John Courtney Murray is right, and Vatican II enshrines John Courtney Murray, then the Roman Catholic Church has changed its doctrine. Because Vatican II is dogma. And I've shown that in a couple videos back. I link you 4 papal statements, clear as day, that you have to accept Vatican II. There's even discussions about how, according to John Courtney Murray, if we've accepted natural law. Now, note, John Courtney Murray is being consistent. He's saying, if we affirm that natural law means a realm that's autonomous, then my argument for Americanism, Vatican II, should be consistent. You should accept that, right? And so you're at a fork in the road. You either have to accept that there is no autonomous natural law realm, and Christ is king, as the Vatican previously said, quas primas says, and he's also king of the civil and social realm. Or you have to go the other route and say, well, no, actually, Christ is not king. He may be king over in the church, in that Gnostic spiritual realm, but in my daily civic life and everything else, state, that doesn't have to do with God. God doesn't speak to the state. God doesn't speak to the civic realm. That's under, quote, natural law, which is autonomous. Now, I know that Roman Catholics confess, well, God relates to natural law as well. He's the ground in natural law. I know you say that, but you also say that it's autonomous. Natural reasoning functions without revelation. Fides et Ratio calls it autonomous. So I'm saying that you guys have the contradiction in the system. And John Courtney Murray is just being more consistent with the false presupposition. He's becoming epistemologically self-conscious with the notion of autonomous natural law. Now, John Courtney Murray gets hit with a lot of critiques from the traditional Catholic world at that time, right? And to be fair to many of the Catholics of that time, I think, Monsignor Fenton, many people in the church in America even were critical of him, saying, you're not being faithful to the idea of confessional states. You have to, that's already been condemned. John Courtney Murray says, it doesn't matter. I don't care, because he says, history is relative when it comes to church-state relations. So he introduces historical relativism. That's the presupposition of his argument. He says, I don't care that there was confessional states 1,000 years ago. That was for that time. Things have evolved. Morals evolve. That's Francis's position. Francis the Jesuit. All right. The next section, we'll get into the characters who play a key role in cooking up the doctrinal warfare program. I did not make this up. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is a well-known thing. It's called the doctrinal warfare program. It was birthed in the Cold War. Gustav Weigel, the famous Jesuit, will be involved in this. John Courtney Murray, obviously. And it will require more. There will be arguments against. Archbishop Connell and Fenton will continue to oppose Murray. Doesn't matter. Nobody cares. This is we're almost to John the 23rd. John the 23rd will, of course, be the ally of these liberals. And then Paul VI will take it to the next step. Now, notice the succession of the papal office holders after Pius XII, right? Now, I'm not a traditional Catholic. I was, but I'm not anymore. I don't really have a leg in that game, but it is true that after Pius XII, when you get John the 23rd, things get more and more and more radical. So it's not an accident. It's just, who knows? Oh, we'll get the trad pope one day. Really? The trad pope? I mean, we've had a succession of wilder and wilder and wilder dudes. So I don't know where you get this idea that you're going to get the trad guy. And by the way, Benedict XVI was not a trad. Go read his books. He's totally a modernist. He may give the appearance of being trad, but that was a ruse. I mean, has he recanted any of his crazy modernist positions in his books? Not to my knowledge. So I'm not sure, just because he gave people a Latin mass for a time period. I mean, is that all there is to being trad, is having a Latin mass? Maybe you worship the mass above even the faith. That's one thing I noticed when I was in the trad world, was that They worship the mass even. Like as long as you have the mass, like you can believe whatever you want, right? You can believe heresies just as long as you have the mass. Well, this is ritualism, right? This is superstition, and that's always been a problem for this realm, the Roman realm. Religion is, as a tool of the state, will be the big problem here. And now remember, this is interesting because we've been told by how many Roman Catholics over and over and over. And I used to use this argument. Oh, you Orthodox, ha ha ha. You guys, your religion is a tool of the state. Really? You sure you want to make that argument, bro? You sure you want to go in that route? Because I think Wemhoff would have something to say about this. This is really a problem of the history of the church everywhere. Right? And the Vatican is not immune to this problem. Look back to the Frankish papacy. The Frankish papacy is a tool of the state. Even historians are aware of this. It's not even controversial. Catholic historians are aware of this. All right, let's get to some of these super chats. And by the way, if you want to hear the rest of this talk, the rest of my analysis of Wemhoff, this is a very long book. A lot of bizarre things he will cover later on. Frank Sheed of Sheed Publishing. Sheed and Ward. Remember Sheed and Ward? Are you familiar with this guy? Did you know he was MI5 and Sheed and Ward would eventually publish witchcraft books? Doesn't seem very trad to me. But, whatever. We will get to John Courtney Murray doing acid, tripping balls. We will get to a lot of really interesting things. JFK. You know who JFK's favorite theologian was? John Courtney Murray. Isn't that interesting? All right. Anyway, if you want to hear the full talk, you can subscribe at Jay's Analysis in the member section. And we'll get to the rest of this book. This is an important book. I wish that more people were interested in this. We have a good crowd tonight. We got almost up to 350. But, this is really taking things to a new level in terms of geopolitical depth and analysis. It's for a long time, analysis of Vatican II and the geopolitical setting was confined to these kind of really simplistic, good America and the West versus the communists and the communist infiltrators. And it's not that simple, right? Many of these people and the liberals in the Roman Catholic Church were not working for Moscow. They were not working for the KGB. Okay, this is a Cold War narrative that is bogus. Some were. But the real power structure here are the elite Western banking, Wall Street, industrial families, especially WASP elite who want to turn the Roman Catholic Church into an agent of Americanism. And how ironic that now those interests, those American business interests, right? You could see this now. They are not finding help from Francis, who is just the latest iteration of the revolution, who has now sided with China. This is preposterous. Okay, Francis turns down Pompeo, says, "I'm not meeting with you. I recognize the Chinese communist bishops." This is just the latest iteration of the revolution. And how many decades is it going to take before the Roman Catholics realize that it's the papacy itself that is the innovation? And yes, they've changed the doctrine. You've had 60 plus years. 60 plus years of Vatican II. And you're acting like it's not doctrine. The papacy has been enforcing it as doctrine for 60 plus years. They don't care if you want to sit around and LARP as if you don't have to accept Vatican II. Yes, you do. Any Novus Ordo church will make you accept Vatican II. So you can pretend in your head all day long that you don't have to, but yes, you do. And it's clearly a change of dogma. Just the idea of church and state relations is a clear way to prove it's a change in dogma. Eurodivi, $3.78 says some link. St. Gabriel of Confessor and Fool for Christ. I don't know what that link is, but thank you for that. So hopefully it's not something crazy. I don't know. But Free Thinker, $5. Jay, great work. Since we were talking about Jesuits, have you heard of Alberto Rivera? Okay, this is not the Seventh-day Adventist, evangelical, goofy, low IQ conspiracy thing. Okay, I'm not trying to be mean to you. I appreciate the super chat, but we're not doing that. That is the low IQ tier stuff. This is a Catholic writing about intelligence agencies using secret societies and groups. By the way, Opus Dei is also connected to the CIA. It's not hard to figure that out. This is not low IQ Seventh-day Adventist conspiracy theory stuff. I'm sorry, but we got to move past that. Okay. Quantum Time Travel Anonymous, $33. What is the last part of Ecclesiastes? I don't have a Bible laying around. I don't know off the top of my head what Ecclesiastes 10:19 is. Somebody want to put Ecclesiastes 10:19 in the chat? And I will try to give you a coherent exegesis. Anybody? Since you donated $3, I want to. Here, I'll just look it up on my phone here. Ecclesiastes 10:19. Let's see what it is. Ecclesiastes 10:19. A feast is made for laughter, wine makes life merry, and money is the answer for everything. I would say that this is in a limited sense. All right, he doesn't literally mean that money answers everything in life. He's saying that from the day-to-day life perspective, right? Money can answer and solve a lot of problems. I don't think, or some people will exegete that as Ecclesiastes is Solomon kind of reflecting on, if you don't have God and you just have a natural existence, then your life will just be about food, fun, and money. So people will exegete it in different ways. I don't think, he ends Ecclesiastes by saying that it's your duty to remember God and fear him because you're going to be judged, right? So I don't think it's the atheist Solomon giving his answers for life. I would exegete it. I would explain it as him saying that in a relative sense, for day-to-day living, money solves a lot of problems, right? But even Jesus says, make friends of yourself of the unrighteous mammon. And I think my understanding is that he's saying that the tools that you have, the things in this life, money, etc., he's saying use them for the advancement of the kingdom for God's glory, right? So even though, in a sense, you could say in this world, mammon is unrighteous mammon because it's usually based around immoral principles, usury, this kind of stuff, you still have to, in this life, make use of mammon. So, same idea there. But a good question. Anybody else have any other questions before we close it out tonight? Anyway, I hope you enjoy this stream. We see then the crux of this being that the Jesuits are bad news for a long time. This does not mean that every single Jesuit is part of a vast, elaborate conspiracy. It does not mean that every Jesuit is part of the CIA. It means that key people and characters have been chosen and used for different purposes and practices. Malachi Martin himself is one of those people. And you can even trace this out. If you've read enough of Malachi Martin, you can even figure this out in his writings. He contradicts himself multiple times. Even he says bizarre, heterodox things. Okay. Anyway, and we saw him tracing out some of the more notorious Jesuits in our day. There are numerically more notorious Jesuits that are qualitatively more notorious than the Jesuits 100 years ago. Nowadays, they're like off the charts. They're saying crazy stuff, dude. But they're just the latest iterations of revolutionary thought, and many of them even call themselves revolutionaries. And what we want to understand is that it's not a liberal Marxist thing. Some of them may like Marxist ideas and ideology. Teilhard did. Does that mean that Teilhard is a Marxist? Not really, because he's a transhumanist, you see. And so we can't locate the problem in Russia and Moscow. Okay, Russia and Moscow had the same technocratic problems exported to them from the West that destroyed and wrecked the country for 70, 80 years, and now beginning to recover. So it's not Russia and the errors of Russia, like Fatima says, that's the problem. Did the Mary of Fatima, did she not know that the errors of Russia came from the West? It's odd. Well, it's not odd if Fatima fits perfectly into the geopolitical warfare that Wemhoff's talking about. Now it makes perfect sense. All right, thank you guys. It's been a good chat. Again, if you're watching this, you want to see the second half, subscribe at Jay's Analysis, and we will go deeper into the Jesuits and John Courtney Murray and the doctrinal warfare program.